Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready to dig into some serious history.
Always up for a deep dive.
We're tackling the Civil Rights Act of 1964 today,
Big one.
using Mr. Hutchings' history as our guide, and let me tell you, it's a wild ride.
Definitely not your typical textbook story.
We're going to uncover not just what the act did, which was massive, but all the unexpected ripple effects. Buckle up for some wait what moments.
There are some surprising twists and turns for sure.
Super glad to have you here to help us untangle it all.
Happy to be here.
So, gotta start with the basics, right? This act was all about dismantling segregation.
At its core, yeah. Restaurants, schools, jobs, the whole whites-only system. Gone.
Huge. But it wasn't just some random good idea, was it? This was part of LBJ's vision, that whole Great Society thing.
Absolutely. Johnson wasn't just aiming for desegregation. He wanted to fundamentally reshape American society. Equal opportunity for everyone, regardless of race or background.
Wow.
Think healthcare, education, fighting poverty. It was a massive undertaking, and the Civil Rights Act was meant to be like the bedrock of it all.
Ambitious is an understatement. But Mr. Hutchings pointed out some hiccups, right? Like, in the South, where segregation was a law, it worked. But in the North, not so much.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. In the South, you had what we call de jure segregation, literally written into law. But in the North, it was more de facto, hidden in things like housing patterns, which neighborhoods got better schools, where the jobs were.
So you could have two restaurants, both technically following the law, but one's in a wealthy, mostly white area, and the other struggling in a predominantly black neighborhood.
Exactly. And that created a lot of frustration in northern black communities. They'd been promised equality, but their daily reality didn't change much.
Which brings us to something the act didn't even touch voting rights. That was a whole other can of worms.
It was a huge issue. We have to remember, even as the Civil Rights Act was being debated, black people, especially in the South, were still being systematically blocked from voting.
It's crazy to think that was still going on in 1964.
Literacy tests that were impossible to pass, poll taxes they couldn't afford, and sometimes outright threats and intimidation.
Wow. But why wasn't voting included in the Civil Rights Act itself? Seems like a no-brainer.
It was a political minefield. A lot of southern states saw voting rights as their own business, not something the feds should be meddling in. Even getting the Civil Rights Act passed was a huge fight.
So you've got this act that's supposed to be this big victory, but it's got all these limitations, and it was super controversial. What was the reaction like? Was everyone just thrilled?
And not even close. This is where the story takes some unexpected turns. While many, of course, celebrated it as a huge step forward, there were also powerful reactions on both sides of the racial divide that really revealed just how divided America was.
Right. The podcast mentioned riots in black neighborhoods just weeks after the act was passed. It's shocking what was going on there.
Think about it. For black Americans, especially in the North, the act raised expectations sky high. But when those deeper problems for poverty, lack of opportunity, police brutality didn't just vanish, that hope turned into anger. For many, the act felt more symbolic than a real solution.
So it's almost like the act backfired. By highlighting what wasn't being fixed, it made things even more tense.
It's one way to look at it. And then you have the other side of the coin, the white backlash. And not just in the South.
Right. The podcast talked about George Wallace, governor of Alabama. He was like the poster child for segregation.
Right. Wallace was fiercely opposed to integration. And what's interesting is how much support he had. He was wildly popular with a lot of working-class white voters, especially in the South. They saw the Civil Rights Act as a threat to their way of life, their jobs, their communities.
So Johnson, who pushed so hard for the act, was basically stuck between a rock and a hard place.
He was walking a tightrope, trying to do what he thought was right, but facing fire from all sides. The podcast even quotes him saying, "We have just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a generation." That's how high the stakes were.
And it wasn't just the South, right? The North had its own version of this backlash.
Absolutely. In northern cities, many white communities also felt threatened by the act, fearing they'd lose out on jobs and housing. That economic anxiety really fueled racial tensions in the years that followed.
So it's like this act, while incredibly important, also cracked open this Pandora's box of unrest and backlash.
It's a complex picture. The act exposed just how deep the divisions in American society really were, and those tensions didn't just disappear overnight.
And didn't this dissatisfaction also spill over into the civil rights movement itself?
You're right. The fight for equality didn't end with the Civil Rights Act. In fact, things were about to get even more intense.
So last time, we were talking about how the Civil Rights Act, even though it was this landmark achievement, also stirred up a lot of unrest and backlash.
Yeah, a good reminder that progress, isn't always a neat and tidy thing. It can get messy, unpredictable.
And for the Civil Rights Movement itself, things were about to take a pretty sharp turn, right?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. The Act's limitations, those deep economic inequalities we talked about, the ongoing violence and discrimination, it all kind of contributed to this shift in the movement, you know? You saw this rise of what they called Black Power, much more assertive, even militant at times, compared to, say, Dr. King's nonviolent approach.
All right, and the podcast mentioned Stokely Carmichael. Was he one of the key figures in that shift?
Oh, absolutely. Carmichael, brilliant organizer, powerful speaker. He really embodied that new energy that was surging through the movement. He just flat out rejected the idea of integration into a system he saw as fundamentally racist.
So it wasn't about asking for a seat at the table anymore.
Nope. He was calling for Black self-reliance, economic empowerment, Black communities having control over their own destinies.
So they wanted to build their own table, so to speak.
You got it. They were demanding really fundamental changes to the power structures, the systems that kept Black Americans disadvantaged. It wasn't just about ending legal segregation anymore. It was about dismantling the whole system.
So the act, in a way, it kind of fueled this more radical phase of the movement.
Yeah.
By showing what it could achieve, but also, all that it left undone.
Definitely played a role. Raised expectations, sure, but also kind of exposed the limits of what just changing laws can really do.
Like that old saying, right? You've come a long way, baby, but...
But you've got a long way to go.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to this question of the act's lasting legacy. I mean, what kind of impact did it have beyond those immediate reactions, beyond that shift in the movement?
Because even though it had its flaws, it had to have changed America in some pretty big ways, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's considered this watershed moment in civil rights enforcement, a precedent for a lot of future legislation, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, directly addressed that whole disenfranchisement of Black voters we talked about earlier. So it was like a stepping stone, paving the way for even more progress down the line.
Precisely. It provided the legal framework, the tools for the government to really challenge discrimination across so many areas. Education, employment, housing, voting. The impact of this thing went way beyond 1964.
But it didn't solve everything, did it? The podcast was pretty clear about that.
No, you're right. It dismantled that legal segregation in the South for sure, but a lot of deeper issues remained. Poverty, lack of good education, those economic disparities, those problems continued to plague Black communities, especially up north.
Like treating the symptoms, but not really curing the disease,
That's a great way to put it. The Civil Rights Act, it was a big victory, no doubt. But it also showed just how much work was left to do to address those really deep-rooted systemic causes of inequality.
So we've got this act. There's both a triumph and a work in progress. A pretty complex picture, and I guess it makes sense that historians would have different takes on how we should think about it, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Historians have been debating the meaning and the legacy of the act for decades. All these nuanced perspectives that help us grasp just how complex it really is.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of those different schools of thought?
Well, you've got your traditionalists. They see the act as this major triumph, like the culmination of all those years of struggle, of activism. They really emphasize its groundbreaking nature, the role of those big figures like LBJ.
The classic good guys won narrative.
In a very simplified sense, yeah. Then you have the continuity school. They see the act as, part of a longer process, building on what came before, not necessarily some radical departure.
Not a revolution, but like an evolution of things that were already happening.
Exactly. Then you've got the radicals. They're more critical. They argue that the act just didn't go far enough, that it didn't fix those root causes of racial inequality like poverty and economic disparities. More symbolic than truly transformative,
So they acknowledge it was important, but also point out its shortcomings.
Right. And finally, you've got your social historians. They really emphasize the everyday people, the grassroots activism, all that organizing, the protests, putting pressure on the government.
It's not just about the big names and the political deals. It's about the power of ordinary people coming together to make change.
Absolutely. Each of these perspectives kind of shines a light on a different part of the act, its complexity. No one way to see it, I guess.
It's like we're putting together this puzzle with all these different pieces.
Perfect analogy. And as we head into the last part of our deep dive here, we'll try to fit all those pieces together, see what it all means for us today. How do we apply those lessons from the Civil Rights Act to the challenges we face in the 21st century?
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this, haven't we? All the ups and downs, all those unexpected twists and turns of the Civil Rights Act. But now for the big question, right? What does all this history, all this stuff from way back when, what's it got to do with us today?
Yeah, that's the heart of it, isn't it? This act, it's more than a history lesson. I mean, even with all its limitations, it gives us this really powerful lens for looking at inequality, how it still plays out today in the 21st century.
Right, right. I mean, we talked about how the act, it didn't really fully fix those economic gaps. And look at where, I mean, the gap between the rich and poor was still massive, right?
It is, and it's a gap that often, still falls along racial lines. We see it everywhere. I mean, wealth, healthcare, education, even just how our neighborhoods are designed. It's this reminder that just because something's equal on paper, legally, doesn't mean it actually plays out fairly in real life.
So what can we learn from that, from the Act's shortcomings? How do we even start to tackle those deep-rooted inequalities that are still with us?
Well, one big takeaway, I think, is that laws, yeah, they're important, but they're not some magic solution. We got to go deeper, beyond just changing the rules. We got to look at the whole system, the systems that are creating and perpetuating this inequality.
Like what kind of systems?
Well, you name it. Housing policies, school funding, access to loans, capital, all that stuff. It all plays a part.
So it's more about like dismantling those structures that are holding certain groups back, not just trying to make things, equal on the surface.
You got it. And it requires a whole shift in thinking, Instead of just leveling the playing field, we got to be actively creating opportunities, right? Especially for folks who've been historically shut out. It's about equity, not just equality.
You know what else really struck me? All that backlash against the act, not just from, white communities, but even from some within the Black community who felt like it just didn't go far enough.
Yeah, that's crucial. Reminds us change, social change. I mean, it's messy, it's complicated. There's often resistance, even from the folks who might actually benefit from the change, and there's always that danger of complacency, thinking, oh, we passed a law, job done, but it's not that simple.
So how do we deal with that today? I mean, how do we build coalitions for change, even when there's pushback, disagreement?
Well, that's where I think the civil rights movement, they really offer some timeless lessons. Look at how they organized, how they mobilized, built alliances. They just challenged the status quo relentlessly. They didn't give up, even when things got tough.
They do. It was a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And they understood that those most affected by inequality, their voices, they have to be leading the charge.
Right.
Their voices got to be front and center.
So I guess what we're saying is the Civil Rights Act, it's not just a history lesson. It's a challenge, right, to each of us to keep fighting for a more just world.
It's a living legacy. It reminds us that progress is possible, but it takes work, constant effort, a willingness to face those hard truths about ourselves, about our society, and a real commitment to building a better future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, huge thanks to you for helping us unpack all this. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure.
And to you, listening out there, thanks for diving deep with us. We hope this got you thinking, maybe even inspired you to take some action out there in the world. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding where we are now and where we want to go. So keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep fighting for a more just world. Thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.